Yeah, so coming to the question, the general solution to the following homogeneous ordinary differential equation, homogeneous ODE. So this is my given differential equation and this is the solution of it. Okay, this is nothing but a maths question from differential equation, right? So we want the values of lambda 1 and lambda 2 from here. Okay, so how we can go about it? We have a second degree differential equation, right? D square, as you can see. So here it's pretty much simple. So let's assume so we just assumed from the mathematical aspect, okay, and we took this equation, given equation, and rewrote in this particular manner. And now this is pretty much easy for us. This can be written as m plus 3 into m plus 1. Okay, just a quadratic equation, and we try to solve that. Okay, so this implies that m will be equal to what? M equal to minus 3 and minus 1. Okay, so basically what we do is, if we have a homogeneous ordinary equation, we can rewrite it, and the roots of this particular equation, quadratic equation, can be taken as this form. So the solution basically is in this form, right? E power lambda 1t plus c2 into e power lambda 2t. So here m is nothing but my lambda. Okay, so you can change the variable, that doesn't matter. So here lambda 1 will be minus 3 and lambda 2 will be minus 1. Okay, so just look at the options and you can see I think it's option A, right? So this is the first question of maths. Okay, so it's pretty simple. Now let's go to the second question. Oh yeah, this is an interesting question. So basically this year from 2020, what happened is, if you see the syllabus of mechanical metallurgy, you get to see some words like stress tensors, compliance tensors, etc. So usually how you go about this is, in terms of tensors, we write Hooke's law. So we know what is Hooke's law, right? Okay. So first of all, what is the question? So question is, they are asking the number of independent elastic constants. So for that you have to know what is this elastic constant. Then we can go about and think of how many we have, right? So what is Hooke's law? Basically we know, usually we write stress equal to Young's modulus into strain, correct? This is my Hooke's law. Okay, a simple form of Hooke's law. But in tensorial forms, okay, when tensor is nothing but when we are considering dimensions and all, right? So here we get sigma ij equal to Cijkl into epsilon kl. So this is how we write in terms of tensors. Okay, so basically these indices I, J, K, L are nothing but the direction aspects of it. Okay, so we call this sigma ij as a second rank tensor, okay, second rank stress tensor, whereas here the same with the strain tensor. Okay, it is called second rank strain tensor. Now this guy over here is called my stiffness tensor. Okay, so we call the magnitude of this to be the Young's modulus. Okay, so stiffness tensor is basically, we have how many indices? We have 4 indices. So this is fourth rank or fourth order tensor that we call. So basically what are these ranks and all? So what we try to do is, we try to represent any quantity in terms of matrices. Okay, so it helps us to solve in a pretty better way. Okay, so what I mean by matrices is, basically if I have some nth order tensor, I have 3 power n as my, oh sorry, not 3 power n, basically it is n by n will be the order of the matrix. Okay, so this is how you can go about and try to see. Okay, I think it's 3 power n only, sorry for that. So basically stress tensor, we have 3 square, so we have 3 by 3 matrix. Okay, I hope you already know what is a stress tensor. Basically again, the strain tensor also has 3 by 3 matrix, and this stiffness matrix over here has 3 power 4. That means you have 81 elements in the matrix. Now we want each of these element. So these element which we are telling is taken to be the elastic constant. Okay, so how you write it is, let me take C to be C11, C12, C13, etc. And this is a symmetrical matrix. Okay, so what is symmetry? So the same part will be repeat here. Okay, now what we want to know is about an isotropic material. Before discussing about an isotropic material, we'll see what is Cij for cubic. So basically you can also simplify this into sigma I equal to epsilon Cij into epsilon j. Okay, the same thing but in a more simplified way. That means you only have less directions, less indices involved. Okay, so what you write here? Okay, let me replace this here. Okay, so basically Cij of cubic can be written as something like this. Okay, so we have three independent constants, C11, C12, C12, 0. Actually it's a 6 by 6 matrix. So let me try to fit in over here. Okay, that's fine. So we have C11, C12, C11, and we have C44 over here. Okay, so these are different terms, okay, that you have to know, and each of them is called as an elastic constant. And as I said, it is a symmetrical part. What is symmetric? Symmetric matrix is when A is equal to A transpose, right? So just flip the terms in the lower side and you get the complete matrix. This is what you see as the elastic constants. So here we have three important constants in cubic material. We have C11, C12 and C44, right? Whereas as we come about this guy, an isotropic material, okay, for an isotropic material what you see is this C4 is related with C1 and C11 and C22 again. Okay, so C44 can be written as C11 minus C12 by 2. So out of the three independent constants that you have, you can definitely say that you only need 2 now, because we have a relation here, right? So for an isotropic material, you have to know that you have 2 independent elastic constants. Of course you may have 3, but out of which only 2 are independent. If you know 2, the third one is automatically known, right? This is about the independent elastic constants. Okay, so you can study about these more in the book Mayers and Chawla. Okay, there is a very good topic about explaining all these. Okay, so the tensorial forms of it and all. you can directly go about it, right? Fine. So this is the second question, where we calculated the number of independent constants. Now let's go to the next question. So now this is the 13th question, where it is asking, someone unmuted, guys. Hey, why are you taking these screenshots? This will be again disturbance for people who watch. Don't worry, guys. You'll be getting all the videos. So you can see, what you can do is just try to make notes. Don't just rely on the screenshots. You write it in your own way, how you can understand. Okay. So you can again rewatch in the recordings. If you are actually flooding with screenshots, many people think that some question is popping up and there is a disturbance, right? So yeah, try to avoid it. Okay, no problem. If you want, I can share it. I can discuss it later on also. Cool, but not in the class. Fine. Okay, so let's discuss the third question for the day, which is asking about a slip system. So a slip system is nothing but a combination of slip direction and slip plane, right? So we know what are slip planes and what are slip directions. Okay, so slip planes are the planes on which you get to see slip taking place, and also what direction slip is taking place will help you to explain about the slip direction. Okay, so now these are basically indicated in terms of HKL and UVW, right? So this is my slip plane and this is the direction of the slip, right? So now it's pretty much easy, that as I said, that if you have a plane, okay, this is my slip plane, let's take this is my slip plane, and definitely the slip direction is only there on this particular plane, right? Why? Because only on the slip plane you can observe the slip, and only in this particular direction. That means you can easily say that slip direction always lies in a slip plane. So we know the condition for this. If a direction is lying in a plane, we can simply say that the dot product between these two is 0, right? So HU plus KV plus LW must be equal to 0. That's it, right? So why this is used? Because usually a slip is basically represented by its plane normal. Okay, slip plane is represented by its slip normal. So let's say this is my plane normal passing through this plane. So again remember that any plane normal has the same indices as the plane itself, but only thing is the normal is a direction and we know a plane is a 3D element, right? So the representation is important. So we know that we have two different directions and we can see that both are perpendicular to each other. So you can easily say that this condition can be used, and from where we get this particular condition, it's coming from the cos theta formula, which is nothing but the dot product divided by the modulus of each vector, right? This is what is the formula that we have, okay, for cos theta, right? So this is a simple problem. So here we said that the angle is 90 degrees, they are perpendicular. So if you just take cos 90, it is 0. So from here you get this particular condition, and just on verifying you can see that which one is not a valid slip system. So they are asking which one is actually not a slip system. So if you see here, in the first case, 1 into 1 plus 1 into minus 1 is 0 plus 1 into 0. So this is valid. Now coming to option B, if you see minus 1 into 0 is 0, 1 into 1 plus 1 into 1. So the condition is not satisfying here. So that is not a valid slip system. So my answer would be B. Okay, it's very simple that any slip direction must always lie in a slip plane. Cool. Now coming to the next question. Dielectric material. So what is a dielectric material? So dielectric materials are basically electrical insulators. Okay, so yeah, in the definition itself you can get the answer. So D option is the electrical insulator. But it is an electrical insulator, but this can be polarized. Okay, an electrical insulator that can be polarized by some applied electrical field. Okay, usually there will be a dipoles generating in the body. Okay, so what happens is basically these are used for storing the electrical charge, because anyway it usually cannot conduct electricity as they are insulators. So it will store the electrical energy in it. Okay, and sometimes you see that even heat is basically dissipated out, okay, when you apply this electrical field. So the options are electrical conductor, metallic magnet, two coupled electrical conductors, and electrical insulator. So the answer is insulator, right? The next question, which one of the following process is an example of electrolytic cell? So first of all, let's understand what is an electrolytic cell. Okay, so we have basically two types of cells. One is an electrolytic cell and the other one is galvanic cell. Okay, so I hope you know what is a galvanic cell, right? So galvanic cell is where you see that an electrical charge is produced by some reactions which we call redox reactions. Okay, what is a redox reaction? It is nothing but a combination of an oxidation and a reduction. So basically we have two half reactions taking place. Okay, so let's take zinc copper galvanic cell. So we see zinc will oxidize to form Zn+2, and because it's leaving 2 electrons, it is actually forming +2, whereas my copper +2 will gain these 2 electrons and it will form copper metal. Okay, so you see that this is an oxidation reaction and this is a reduction reaction. Okay, so here there is no external supply of electricity. Okay, so electrons are basically moving in my electrolyte due to these particular reactions. Okay, so this is basically galvanic couple or galvanic cell, which we call E, is basically helping for corrosion. Okay, so definitely my option A is wrong, right? Because they are asking an electrolytic cell and corrosion is galvanic cell. Now, what is electrolytic cell? So electrolytic cell is a cell which requires an external electrical supply. Okay, so it requires some external electrical source. Why? Because it wants to initiate this reaction. Okay, so to initiate a non-spontaneous, okay, we call a non-spontaneous redox reaction. Okay, what is this non-spontaneous reaction? So non-spontaneity means then basically it cannot happen without any external source. Okay, or you can say the delta G is greater than 0. Okay, you can also merge with thermodynamics, right? So only when you provide some external electrical source, there will be these electron flow. Okay, because the reaction will take place. Okay, that means the electrolytic cell is actually converting electrical energy into chemical energy. Okay, electrical energy is converted into chemical energy, which is just opposite to what is galvanic cell. So here chemical energy is producing my electrical energy. Okay, so chemical energy is basically converted into electrical energy. This is in the case of galvanic cell. Okay, so you can see the options now. Okay, so charging of a rechargeable battery. Let's take your mobile phone. It is a rechargeable battery. You are connecting to some external power supply and you are charging it. That means you are providing some external source of current, electricity, to produce some chemical reaction so that your battery gets charged up. So definitely charging of a rechargeable battery is an electrolytic cell, whereas discharging is again what? You are consuming the electricity produced by some chemical energy. That means if you are using your mobile phone without charging, okay, you are just using it as usual without any electrical supply, then it is acting as a galvanic cell. Okay, whereas if you are charging it, it will be like an electrolytic cell, right? So this is about this particular question where you have electrolytic cell and galvanic cell. Okay, so now let's move to the next question. Yeah, so again a theory question where they're asking about selective leaching. Okay, so which one of the following is true regarding selective leaching, right? So here we have different options for us, but before that let's see what is this selective leaching. So selective leaching is a kind of corrosion, you can say, right? So what you get to see in selective leaching is that a more reactive or a high electronegative element. What is electronegativity? Electronegativity is that the ability of some particular element to share an electron, to form a bond. Okay, so a higher electronegative element, or you can also say less noble, okay, noble or inert element will be leached out, will be removed out. Okay, so best example is dezincification. Okay, so in your copper zinc alloy, you get to see this copper zinc alloy is nothing but your brass. Okay, so in brass you see that if you use in some particular conditions, you see that zinc is removed out and you see some dark patches. Okay, brownish red patches are formed. Okay, that means that the zinc is removed out slowly. Okay, depending on the atmosphere surroundings, this will be happening. Okay, so this has many names: de-alloying, selective corrosion, or selective leaching. Okay, so coming to the options, so what we need is higher electronegative element or less inert element. That means it has to be rapid in involving some reaction, right? So if you can see, we can directly have the C option, because they asked that they gave the more electronegative element is leached out. That is what is the principle of selective leaching, right? So that's done. Now coming to the next question, in a green sand casting, which one of the following is not a part of the gating system? Runner, sprue, riser and pouring basin. Unfortunately, this question was a mark to all Okay, that means this is an add score to everyone, because the question itself is wrong, because the gating system consists of all the 4 options. Okay, nothing is an answer. Why? Because what is a gating system? So if you are thinking about casting, so you have a pouring basin, okay, then you have a sprue connected to it, which is a vertical passage, okay, and then this will basically go into the runner, and then this will be distributed to my different gates. Okay, so these are the gates going to my mold cavities. Okay, so here if you carefully see, this is my pouring basin, this is my sprue, this is my runner. Now where is the riser? So riser is basically used to compensate any shrinkages taking place. So usually just above your mold cavity, you provide some small amount of metallic reservoir, so that if there is any shrinkage taking place, this metal present in the riser, fortunately this is the last liquid to solidify. Okay, so if there are some solidification shrinkages, these can be compensated from the liquid. So if there is any shrinkage formed, the liquid present in the riser will fill it up, okay, due to the gravity, right? So all these given options are part of my gating system. So the question itself, is marks to all, right? Now going to the next question. For a material to exhibit superplasticity, one of the requirement. So before discussing it, what is superplasticity? The superplasticity, okay, superplasticity is the ability of a particular material to elongate, that means to deform in a very large manner. Okay, the condition is that it should not neck. Okay, so let me write it for you. So superplasticity is the ability of a material to withstand very high deformations, okay, very high or very large deformations, okay, and of course in tension. And as I said, what is the condition? Without necking. Okay, so superplasticity is the ability of a material to withstand very high deformations. Usually we talk about 100% to about 1000%. Okay, so the length, if you have L, it is actually converting into a maximum of 1000 L after deformation, right? And the best part is it is not necking. If there is some neck formation, what happens? There will be some microvoids generating and ductile fracture will be easy. But the best part is necking is not present. So this is basically seen in various titanium alloys, okay, given in some iron alloys also. Okay, so what are the conditions? So we have some important conditions or the requirements for superplasticity. Okay, so the first thing is the temperature should be at least higher than half of its melting point, right? Because at higher temperature, we know that it behaves in a very good ductile manner, and also the diffusivities will be more, so atomic movements will be good. And we know why it is ductile, because at higher temperatures the flow stress required for deforming a material will come down. Okay, so higher temperature. The next thing is fine grains. Okay, you require a very fine grains, about less than 10 micrometer. Okay, so fine grains are also needed. If you have some coarse grains, then there may be some transgranular fracture, because at higher temperature your grain boundaries are actually weaker. Okay, so intergranular cracking may form. Okay, and also we need to maintain these fine grains, and as we are increasing the temperature, what happens? We are actually going into the better conditions for grain growth to take place. Okay, so at higher temperature, basically there will be grain boundary slidings and grain growth will be favorable. We don't want that. So to suppress that, what we do is we add some second phase particles, okay, like dispersoids, okay, which can sustain this particular temperature. So second phase particles, this will resist the grain growth. Okay, again, if grain growth is there, your condition will not fulfill. Okay, what else? Now coming to the strain rates. Okay, so require low strain rate. Okay, because low strain rates are helpful for better ductility, because the flow stress will come down. So I think many of you know this, there is a relation between the stress and the strain rate. Okay, C into epsilon naught power mv. Here epsilon naught is nothing but my strain rate. Okay, so from here you can see, if epsilon naught is less, obviously your sigma will be low. Okay, and obviously we can say about that m over here. M is my strain rate sensitivity. So high strain rate sensitivity. Okay, which is M. Higher M is required. Okay, before that, what is M? So M is my log sigma 2 by sigma 1 divided by log of epsilon naught 2 by epsilon naught 1. Okay, so in order to maintain this lower strain rates, you actually have higher M values. Okay, so these are the conditions for superplasticity. Okay, so now let's come to the options. So A option is coarse grained microstructure. No, we don't want it. High strain rate sensitivity, yes. Low strain hardening exponent, no. Actually strain hardening exponent is coming in the flow stress. Okay, so we know what is this, sigma equal to k into epsilon power n. Okay, so here rather than the strain hardening exponent, we want strain rate sensitivity. High modulus of elasticity, no, not at all, because if you have higher modulus of elasticity, then the strength will be very high. That means it is considered to be a brittle material. Right, so these are some important conditions, and remember from this year we have MSQs, right? So don't just say that I got B and I'm just moving on to the next question. No, just try to hold on and verify all the options that are present to you, right? So now coming to the next question. So it's pretty much easy. The dye penetrant test for detecting flaws is based on what? So in dye penetrant test, what we do, we basically add some liquid dye on the surface. Okay, so dye penetration test or dye penetrant test, we use some liquid dye, okay, on the surface. So if you have any surface cracks or surface flaws, this liquid will tend to go and occupy the flaws. Okay, so this is by capillary action. Okay, here no magnetism is required, no sound propagation is required, no X-ray is involved. Capillary action is nothing but the ability of any liquid to flow into narrow gaps without any external forces like gravity. Okay, so dye penetrant test is basically dependent on this capillary action, okay, which is the ability of my liquid dye we are using to flow into the narrow flaws, narrow cracks that you have without any external force, right? So this is about dye penetrant test. Now coming to the next question, when 1 mole of C3H8 at 300 Kelvin is burnt with stoichiometric amount of oxygen, at this temperature to form CO2 and H2O. Okay, that means you are burning it. So C3H8 plus oxygen, and it is forming what? CO2 plus H2O. Okay, so let's try to balance it. So we have 3 carbons, so 3 CO2 and 8H, so 4H2O. So 6 plus 4, 10. So this will be 5O2. So this is a balanced stoichiometric oxygen, right? Because they asked about the stoichiometric amount. That means here if you see, 1 mole of C3H8 will react with 5 moles of oxygen. That means the oxygen amount in order to burn 1 mole of C3H8, because here they said, right, we are burning 1 mole of C3H8. So to burn 1 mole of C3H8, we want 5 moles of oxygen. Okay. Now what they are telling, if C3H8 is burnt under the same conditions but with excess oxygen, what will happen to the temperature? So definitely this is a combustion reaction. So this is an exothermic reaction. So some amount of heat will be liberated out. Okay, because it's a combustion. Every combustion reaction is an external, exothermic reaction. Right. Now what they are telling is, fine, instead of 5 moles, I am using 6 moles or 7 moles. Now tell me what happens to the temperature. Okay, adiabatic flame temperature is when you actually burn this in an adiabatic atmosphere, adiabatic surroundings, right? So what happens? So what are the options? So they are telling that initially when we use stoichiometric amount, we got 597975 Kelvin. Now they are asking what happens if excess oxygen is used. So A option is telling that it is equal to the same temperature irrespective of the amount of excess oxygen. B, higher than 5975. C is lower, and D either higher or lower depending on the amount of excess oxygen. So one thing you have to remember here is, we balanced this equation and we came to a conclusion that 1 mole can only react with 5 moles of oxygen. Okay, that means if you are actually allowing 6 moles of oxygen to react, what happens is here only 5 moles will be used for combustion. Okay, 1 mole C3H8 combustion only takes 5 moles. But what about my extra 1 mole? That is what is we want to study, excess oxygen. Okay, so the rest 1 mole is actually excess oxygen that we are talking about, and this excess oxygen, it will not involve in any reaction. Why? Because already for 5 moles only all my C3H8 is burnt out. There is nothing left out for me, right? Because H2O is a water vapor and CO2 is a gas vapor, so nothing is there in my system to react with the oxygen. So what happens is, this excess oxygen is acting as my coolant. Okay, so it will tend to take away the heat that is produced by the combustion. So what it does, as it is taking the temperature away from the system, it will decrease the adiabatic flame temperature. That is what is the answer. So if you see, C option is the answer. So the temperature is lower than 5975 Kelvin irrespective of the amount of excess. Of course, if you even use 8 moles of O2, you are actually increasing the coolant quantity, right? Instead of 3 moles O2, now you have, instead of 1 mole O2, you have 3 moles O2 as coolant. So more heat will be taken away and more decrease in the temperature, right? So this is an important thing, that any excess other than the stoichiometric amount will act as a coolant, so it will decrease the adiabatic temperature. Cool. Now, the next question. Two solid spheres, X and Y, of identical diameter are made up of different materials having different thermal diffusivity. So let's take D1 is 100 into 10 power minus 6. meter square per second, and the other one, let's take D2, it is 25 into 10 power minus 6 meter square per second. Fine. Both spheres are heated in a furnace maintained at 1000 Kelvin. Okay, so the temperature for both the cases are same, that is 1000 Kelvin. If the temperature of the sphere X reaches 800 Kelvin in 1 hour, okay, the center, right? If the center of the sphere is reaching 800 Kelvin in 1 hour, what is the time required for center of the sphere Y to reach 800 Kelvin? So simple. So this is my X and this is my Y. Okay, so the surroundings here is 1000 Kelvin because it's the furnace temperature. Furnace is maintained at 1000 Kelvin, right? So this particular center is 800 Kelvin, and also here we have 800 Kelvin. But here it is taking how much? 1 hour. 1 hour time, so that the center of this sphere is actually reaching 800 Kelvin. But what is the time for this Y sphere? For the same condition, right? They asked the time required for the center to reach the same temperature 800 Kelvin. So it all depends on the thermal diffusivities, right? So for this you have a concept of dT equal to constant. Okay, why? Because the surrounding temperature is the same and the final temperature, the T1 and T2 are the same. Okay, so the only controlling factor here is the time and the diffusivities, thermal diffusivities of both the materials. So it's pretty easy. D1 T1 equal to D2 T2. So 100 into 10 power minus 6 into what is the time given for it? 1 hour, equal to, this is 25 into 10 power minus 6 into some t. So if you can see, the time required for the second case will be 4 hours. Okay, so the answer would be C option. Okay, so dt equal to constant. This is a pretty simple theory that you get. Okay, the next question now. Okay, so these are the spectra given for emissions from a gray surface, that is nothing but a gray body, and a black body. So what is a black body? So black body is something which can absorb all the radiations. Okay, that means its emissive power is equal to 1, whereas gray body cannot actually absorb all the radiation, so this will be partially absorbing. Okay, so here your emissive power will be less than 1. Okay, so let's say at some particular wavelength the peak here is giving me 1. Okay, spectral emissive power is 1, and okay, consider all the peaks of black body to be equal to 1. Okay, and at that particular wavelength we know that the emissive power of a gray body should be less than 1, and if you see all the different graphs over here, okay, in A basically you don't see those many tortuous graph, you just see a smooth curve even in gray body. So A option is wrong. In B you see that okay, did I just this to be reversed? Yeah, so this dotted one is black, right? So this is 1, this is 1, and this is 1. Yeah, now it's okay. Now if you carefully see that this should be valid at any wavelength. This is one more thing that you have to remember. Okay, at any wavelength black body can absorb more radiation than that of your gray body. So it is only possible in D graph. You can see at all the wavelength the emissive power of black body is always on top. That means greater than the gray body, right? So your option will be D. Now coming to the next question. Again a maths question. Given the three vectors, so we have x to be -1, -1, 1, y to be -1, 2, 1, and z to be 1, 0, 1. Okay, so I'm not going to do it, but if you carefully see, you can easily say that x dot y equal to y dot z equal to z dot x equal to 0. That means all three are mutually perpendicular to each other. Okay, that's when we get, that means the angle between any two xy, yz and zx is 90 degrees. That's what dot product equal to 0 means. So all these are mutually perpendicular. Okay, so my A option is correct. And of course C and D are wrong, because the dot product is 0. They can't make some angle other than 90 degrees. And what about B option? They are asking x, y and z are coplanar. So any three vectors are said to be coplanar when their scalar triple product is 0. Okay, so you can take that any three vectors are coplanar when the scalar dot product is equal to 0. What is scalar dot product? It is nothing but box x, y, z. What is box again? So you take x cross y dot z. If this is equal to 0, we say that it is coplanar. And you can easily check this out, and even this is not the case here. Okay, so the only answer is A, that is x, y and z are mutually perpendicular. That means they make 90 degrees to each other, right? Now the next question. Oh, this is a direct theory question. The angle between two neighboring tetragonal bonds in silicon. So basically tetragonal unit will be something like this. You have SI, you have SI here, SI and the SI. And the angle is 109.5 degrees. Okay, so you can directly see, okay, that even if it is in a diamond cubic, or it may be with oxygen, right, it forms SiO2s, right? So even there you see that the tetragonal bonds where silicon is actually involved is 109.5 degrees, right? Now again a simple theory question. Sequence of precipitation during aging of duralumin or aluminum 4% copper. So precipitation hardening sequence. Okay, precipitation hardening. So we know what happens, right? So firstly we have GP zones formed. Okay, GP zones are nothing but a cluster of solute atoms coming in, which is converted to theta double prime, which is converted to theta prime, and finally you get theta equilibrium, which is CuAl2 in this case. Okay, this is my precipitate. So this is the sequential transformation of precipitation hardening in aluminium 4% copper alloy. Okay, so GP zones are basically coherent, whereas these intermediate precipitates are semi-coherent, and because theta is a separate entity, it is completely incoherent with the matrix. Okay, so this is the sequence that you observe in precipitation hardening. Moving on, again, yeah, 1 mark questions are basically kind of theory questions, so, and conceptual questions. So the indenter used in Rockwell hardness measurements on C scale. So basically in Rockwell you have three scales, right? A scale, B scale and C scale. So you use 60 kg, 100 kg and 150 kg respectively. Okay, 60 kg in A, 100 kg in B and 150 kg in C. Again, these are major loads. We use two types of loads in Rockwell, okay, so which you can study, right? And what are the indenters? So in Rockwell A scale, you use something called as a braille indenter. Okay, whereas Rockwell B scale, you use something called as a steel ball, 1 by 16 inch diameter steel ball, and C scale uses a diamond cone with some rounded tip actually. Okay, so even the braille indenter which I said, okay, is also a diamond cone. Okay, diamond cone indenter. But here in C scale, we actually use a rounded tip. We don't use any sharp tip of the cone, right? So again, on seeing the options, we have diamond cone in A itself. So A option is the answer. Okay. Now again a maths question. So we have a function y equal to a power x. Y equal to a power x, and we want dy by dx. Okay, so it's again simple. So in order to proceed to this, let's apply log or a natural logarithm on both the sides. So this will be ln y equal to x ln a, right? Because a power x, so x comes to the coefficient, right? That's what logarithm works on. Now we can easily apply a differentiation. We can easily differentiate this. So on differentiating, what we get? You have differentiation of ln x is 1 by x dx. That is, here in our case it is y, so it is 1 by y dy equal to, so you can do this in part-wise differentiation. That means what is differentiation of uv? It is u into v dash plus v into u dash, right? So this is how you can use this particular formula over here. So let's take u to be x and v to be ln a. Okay, so u into v dash, so x into, what is differentiation of ln a? Ln a is a constant, so it is 0, plus now v is ln a into differentiation of x is 1. So from here, if you carefully see, you get dy. Of course we are differentiating with respect to x, so this will be dy by dx, okay, equal to, what you get, this is 0, you are only left with ln a, and you have 1 by y on this side. So if you take on the other side, you get y into ln a. Okay, dy by dx is y into ln a. But now they are asking at x equal to 1. Okay, so y is again a power x. So y of 1 is a power 1, which is a. So here dy by dx at x equal to 1 will be equal to a into ln a. Okay, simple. We just have to know that how we can convert our given function to a differentiable function. Okay, yeah, that's it about this question. Now going to the next question, cupola. So cupola furnace is famously used to melt the cast iron. So it is basically a melting device. Cupola furnace is used to melt the cast iron. Okay, and it is basically used to melt cast irons, obviously, in foundry shops. Okay, so in foundry shops, basically, in order to melt, cupola furnaces are used. Okay, these are like small furnaces. The diameters will be usually about 10 feet. Okay, the maximum of 10 feet. Okay, so this is about cupola. Cupola furnace is a simple shell furnace used to melt the cast iron. Okay, now moving on to the next question. The functions y equal to e power x and y equal to e power minus x intersect at a point. Okay, so it's pretty simple, no need to go for the graphs and all. Why? Because when two particular curves are intersecting, we can say that y is same for both the cases, right? The function value itself will be the same. So here at intersection e power x should be equal to e power minus x, and we know this pretty well. This is a theorem which we have studied, I think, long ago in schools. In order to maintain this equality, if the bases are equal, the powers must also be equated. So x equal to minus x. This is only possible when x equal to 0. Okay. And again they are asking the coordinates. So if x equal to 0, what is y? Y equal to e power minus x or e power minus x. Both cases e power 0, it is 1. So the coordinates of the point E will be 0, 1. Okay, x and y are 0 and 1. So my answer is C option. Okay, so what we did here, we just equated the function so that we get the intersection point. Okay, so this is about this particular question, and let's discuss the next question. So this is asking you about a cold worked metal. A heavily cold worked metal will, and they gave different theories or different points about recrystallization. Okay, so what is recrystallization? So recrystallization is nothing but the process of forming new strain free grains. Okay, when the new strain free grains are generated, we call it to be recrystallization. Okay, and there are some standard definitions also, okay, for recrystallization temperature. So what is recrystallization temperature? So we usually represent by TR or T recrystallization. So this is when at least 50% of the sample or the material is recrystallized in 1 hour. That means we have fixed the time here, and we want to know in 1 hour if the material is actually recrystallizing at least for 50%. We can take that to be recrystallization temperature. Okay, but yeah, I think here they did not give about any temperatures. Okay, but how the recrystallization is taking place, what is the driving force? So the driving force here is the excess strain energy. Okay, so there will be excess strain energy generated while cold working. Okay, so cold working is nothing but deforming a body at lower temperatures. So if you deform, what happens is the dislocation density increases. That means the defects in the body are increased. So the strain energy, so there will be some strain associated with all these defects like dislocation. So the excess strain energy is produced. So this we want to reduce. Okay, so this can be reduced by the process of recrystallization. Okay, so if you have very high strain energy, that means there is good driving force. What is this? As I said, this is my driving force. If you have high strain energy in my body, then the recrystallization will be easier, right? That's what usually takes place. Okay, if the driving force is high, the process will be easy. Okay, now there are some laws of recrystallization actually. Okay, laws of recrystallization, okay, which explain about how these difference in any process parameter will affect the recrystallization. Okay, so one thing I already said. Okay, if cold working is high, okay, or the amount of cold working is high or great, then as I said, the recrystallization is easy. That means the recrystallization temperature will decrease. Okay, Now, what about the grain size? So if you have the initial grain size to be fine, okay, initially fine grains, okay, again these strain free grains are very fine grains, okay, so even in this case the TR will come down, okay, because already we have fine grains, okay, so the grain boundary area is more, it can act as a sink for these dislocations, okay. So similarly, if you are increasing the amount of cold work as well as decreasing the initial grain size, you can produce very fine strain free grains, okay. So the first point here is lost, right? They said a heavily cold worked material will yield a coarser recrystallized grain size. No, it is wrong. Just now we have discussed, if the cold working is high and if the initial grain size is low, then you can directly say that what is happening, your grain size is low. That means after recrystallization the grain size will be very fine, okay. And what is the other thing? B option is possess a low driving force. No, on creating more dislocations, what is happening, more amount of strain energy is forming, so more driving force, so even B option is wrong. C, have a high energy barrier for nucleation. No, energy barrier has to do with the nucleation products and the coherences, which is the interfacial energies. But here we don't have any new grains or new, I mean of course new grains, but we don't have any new phase forming, so there is no barrier also. So only thing is the excess strain energy is allowing for the grain movement, grain boundary movements, and resulting in new grains. So D option is correct here, which is a heavily cold worked metal will recrystallize at lower temperature, right? That's what we have discussed. Because if the cold working is high, the excess strain energy will increase, that means the driving force will increase, which will result recrystallization to take place at lower temperatures, right? So yeah, that's it for this question. And coming to this next question, for a given function f of x in the figure, you want that particular integral value. Now, but they did not give any function for us. They just mentioned this graph. You find out your f of x. It's pretty simple. So it's a straight line first of all. So we can write y equal to mx plus c. Okay. And again it is passing through the origin over here. Right? It is definitely passing through the origin. So if something is passing through the origin, this intercept will be 0. So it is in the form of y equal to mx. Okay. And also, if you carefully see this particular point, at x equal to 0.5, y equal to 0.5. At x equal to 1, y is also 1. That means your slope m equal to 1. So this line can easily, on seeing it, y equal to x. Okay, y here is nothing but my f of x. F of x equal to x. Now you want to calculate integral 0 to 1, 1 minus f of x dx. So f of x here is x itself. So 1 minus x dx on replacing f of x. So what you get here? So just it's a simple integration, right? So integration of 1 is x, integration of x is x squared by 2. And just put the limits of 0 and 1. So this is 1 minus 1 square by 2 and 0 is 0 itself. So this is 1 minus 0.5. The answer itself is 0.5. So this is a numerical type question. The answer will be 0.5. So only thing is to see what is your f of x and just integrate directly. Okay. Now the next question. A component subjected to tensile stress in a mechanical device is monitored by NDT. The NDT technique can only detect cracks, both surface and internal, which are larger than 1 mm. Fine. Keeping 10% margin of safety. Okay, this is some new word for us. What is margin of safety? Keeping 10%. Okay, this is equal to 10%. The maximum allowed tensile stress will be how much? and they gave the fracture toughness. Okay, KIC. So we know what is KIC. KIC is what? KIC is sigma max into root pi AC. That means when your crack length is reaching your critical crack length, we say that the toughness or the stress intensity factor will be your fracture toughness, which is KIC. So you can easily calculate your sigma max from here. So KIC is 30 equal to sigma max into root pi into what is AC. Okay, so here this can only detect the cracks which are greater than 1 mm. That means you can take the critical crack length to be 1 mm. So 1 mm is how much? 10 power minus 3 meter. Okay, so on solving it, you get sigma max equal to 535.23, something like that. Okay, I have already solved it. So yeah, that's a simple calculation. Now sigma max is known. Okay, if they will not ask about any margin of safety or other things, this will be your maximum stress that the component can withstand. But here they gave something called as margin of safety. So what is margin of safety? So margin of safety is delta sigma by sigma max into 100 equal to 10, right? So what is delta sigma again? Delta sigma is nothing but my delta max minus delta, sorry, not delta but it's sigma max minus sigma allowed, which is the allowable stress, divided by sigma max into 100 equal to 10. So from here you can directly write, correct? So this is 1 minus sigma allowed by sigma max. Okay, so you know what is this ratio, sigma allowed by sigma max? This particular guy here is called my factor of safety. Okay, so margin of safety is different, factor of safety is different. Okay, so on taking 100 on the other side, you get 0.1, right? So this is sigma A by sigma max equal to how much? 1 minus 0.1, that is 0.9. Therefore, sigma A equal to 0.9 into my sigma max, which is my 535.23. So again on doing it, you get something about 481.71 MPa, right? So again, see about the nearest integer they asked. So it is 482, right? So what we did here, we calculated from the known fracture mechanics concept and calculated the maximum stress, and also from the given criteria that the margin of safety is 10%, we calculated how much of stress is allowed. That's what we want, right? Maximum allowed tensile stress is to be calculated, right? Only two concepts and the problem is done, right? Now coming to the next question, this is about the corrosion rate. So an iron plate with total exposed area of 50 centimeter square undergoes atmospheric corrosion. If 200 grams of weight is lost over a period of 10 years, what is the corrosion rate in kg per meter square per year? This is very, very important. You have to proceed with the units. So basically what is corrosion rate? So we call it CPR, right? Corrosion penetration rate. So this will be taken as W by rho AT. Usually you have some K over here, some multiplication factor, okay, depending on what unit you want to go. But here we don't want to actually go with that because we want kg only. Okay, so basically if you see actually by taking this particular thing, what happens is this rho is my density, okay, again T is my time, A is my area. So these two are done. Okay, so usually we use this particular formula when we want in terms of mils per year. Okay, that means milli inch per year. Okay, but here they are not calculating any weight. Okay, you don't have any kg in it. That is why, what is density again? Density is mass by volume, correct? So on changing all those, you can get this. Or just look at the given values. So what do you want from the units? So you have kg per meter square into year. Okay, so these two will not be there now. Okay, only depending on the units, right? So just have a look at the units that you want and you can formulate easily. So what is kg? Kg is the weight lost, okay, due to corrosion, divided in meter square. What is meter square here? The exposed area. What is year again? Year is my time. So I got my formula for the corrosion rate. Weight lost by exposed area into time. Simple, because this is for our wanted unit. So it's pretty simple. Everything is given. Weight lost is 200 grams. So it is 200 into 10 power minus 3 kg divided by area is 50 centimeters square. So 1 centimeter is 10 power minus 2. So centimeter square is 10 power minus 4 into time. Time is 10. So easy, right? So if you see what is going up, so this is gone. You are left with only 110, and this is also gone because of that. Now 200 by 50, which is what? 4 kg per meter square per year. This is your corrosion rate. So what we did here, you are actually taking in account the given values and the wanted unit, okay, which makes easy for us, right? Now the next question, in the cold rolling, for a sheet to be drawn into rolls, the angle of contact or the angle of bite should be less than or equal to what degree? So what we have, the given value is, the given quotient of friction is 0.1. So mu is 0.1. And in rolling, one important condition is mu should be greater than or equal to tan theta. Right? So here this theta is nothing but your angle of bite or angle of contact. And what is mu here? Mu is 0.1. So mu 0.1 is greater than my tan theta. Or you can again write tan theta is less than or equal to 0.1. So theta is less than or equal to tan inverse 0.1. Again, if you just calculate this tan inverse, you get that value to be theta less than about 5.71 degrees. So this is my 5.71 degrees. Okay, just a simple rolling condition that the quotient of friction should be greater than or equal to the tan theta. Okay, here theta is the angle of contact or angle of bite. Okay, from this only actually you get one more formula of delta H. Okay, so delta H will be usually equal to, sorry, not delta H but H max. The maximum reduction will be equal to mu square R. Okay, from this only you get this. Okay, so usually tan theta is my H by R. So from there this will be formulated. Okay, so this H max is reduction in one pass. Okay, when you pass your sheet or your billet once in between the rolls, what is the maximum reduction of height? That is what you can easily calculate from this, and this we get from this formula only, right? So this is one basic question from rolling. Now going to the last question for the day. Okay, this is the last 1 mark question of 2020 question paper. So they're asking the number of atoms per unit area. Okay, number of atoms per unit area in 100 plane, right? So what is this? What is this formula actually? Number of atoms per unit area is nothing but my planar density. Okay, what is planar density? Planar density is the same thing, the number of atoms centered on a plane divided by the area of the plane. Okay, instead of asking directly as planar density, they just formulated, in a big sentence. number of atoms per unit area in a given plane of PB. And they said that PB is an FCC structure. So let's quickly see what is an FCC structure. So we know what is an FCC structure, face centered cubic. So we have 8 atoms at the corner, and also we have 6 face centered atoms, right? Now we want 100 plane. What is 100? So if you are actually taking X, Y and Z, 100 plane is the Miller indices. So basically this front plane is your 100 plane. Okay, so if I just bring out my 100 plane outside, okay, so you get to see, okay, let me draw a perfect circle for you. Again, don't bother about the shapes, but all these atoms are equal here. Okay, of course it's not showing in that way, but let me try to resize it a bit. Okay, fine, never mind. So all are same atoms, so all are actually of same size. So here, how you can calculate planar density? So again, what is the condition between the lattice parameter and the radius? So you can see by drawing a diagonal, we call this a phase diagonal. Okay, so here if you see, you have, this is my R, this is 2R, right? Complete atom is present, and this is R. So R plus 2R plus R, you have 4R is equal to, what is the phase diagonal? So this is A, and this is also A, and this is the hypotenuse, which is A square plus A, root of A square plus A square, which is root 2A. So in FCC, you can straight away say the condition is 2 root 2 R equal to A. Why we did it? Because we will be using in order to calculate my planar density. Now coming to this plane again, how many atoms we have? Okay, so PD, planar density, is equal to number of atoms divided by the area. So area is clear because it is a square and the side length is A square. Okay, but what about the number of atoms? If you carefully see, we have one complete atom and 4 atoms which are only 1/4 of it occupied in the plane, right? So this is 90 degrees. So 90 is nothing but 1/4 of a sphere. Similarly, this is another quarter. This is another 1/4. This is another 1/4. And one complete atom in the middle. So you have 1 plus 4 into 1/4. So total you have 2 atoms, right? 2 atoms in the plane. So 2 divided by A. So here we are given the atomic radius. Okay, so A equal to how much? 2 root 2 into 0.175. So no need to change it because the units are also asked in the same nanometer. Okay, so 2 by 2 root 2 square into 0.175 square, right? So what you will be getting, 1 by 4, because 2 and 2 gets cancelled, and 0.175 square. Okay, so yeah, you can easily do it, and you get 8.16 as your answer. Okay, 8.16 per nanometer square. Okay, 8.16 is your answer. So yeah, this is about the 1 mark questions of 2020. So in the next class, we'll discuss the 2 marks.